Before we explore today's case, a big thanks to today's sponsor, the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization. I recently got my hands on a copy, and it's fascinating, spanning over 400 beautiful illustrated pages and covering nearly 180 topics. It celebrates humanity's greatest inventions, discoveries, and ideas. What makes this book stand out is the craftsmanship. The level of detail is remarkable, from the rich illustrations to the high-quality paper and premium cover. It feels substantial in your hands. More importantly, it delivers rare knowledge that sparks curiosity and encourages deeper thinking about how our world was built. Reading it has given me a greater appreciation for what life was like hundreds of years ago, and a deeper understanding of the historical figures and eras that I often talk about in my cases. If you're someone who loves to learn, explore big ideas, and see the bigger picture of human progress, this is a must-have. It also makes an exceptional gift, perfect for a curious friend, a collector, or yourself. Use my link below and my promo code BRIEFCASE to get your copy of the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization. Now let's go to late 19th century Spain. Luciana Borcino was born in Vigo, a port city in northwest Spain, in the region of Galicia, on the Atlantic coast. In the mid-19th century, it was still a relatively small but growing maritime town, with a population of around 8,000 inhabitants. Her exact date of birth is unknown, but it is estimated to be in the late 1830s, and she grew up in a period following the First Carlist War. This started in 1833, when King Ferdinand VII died without a son, so the throne passed to his daughter Isabella. However, there were many who did not support her, and instead wanted the deceased king's brother, Don Carlos, to take the throne. His followers, known as Carlists, wanted a traditional monarchy, while Isabella's liberal supporters backed constitutional reform and a more modern government. The war was fought mainly in northern Spain, and was harsh and deeply divisive. It ended in 1840 with victory for Isabella, though tensions between Carlists and liberals continued for many years afterwards. Luciana was not born into nobility, nor into destitution. Her family belonged to the modest working or lower middle ranks of provincial society, respectable, but without great wealth, and like many provincial women of her generation, her family would try to secure her a good marriage. She married a man named José Vázquez Varela, and together with her husband, she moved to Madrid, the country's capital. It was a time when Madrid was expanding, with new boulevards, cafes, theatres, and a growing middle class. There she established herself as a respectable married woman, and gave birth to a son, who the couple named José Vázquez Varela Borcino. Widowhood came much earlier than a woman of Luciana's age would have expected. In Spain in the 1880s, a widow could legally control her own property and finances, yet security depended greatly on prudence, reputation, and the careful management of what had been left to her. After her husband's death, Luciana was left to oversee her affairs alone, to guard her household and her income with vigilance, and in the neighbourhood she became known simply as the Widow Varela, a title that acknowledged both her loss and her standing. Her husband had not left her destitute. In fact, following his death, she became a woman of comfortable means. She lived in a modest yet respectable apartment on Fuencarral Street, and was regarded as charitable, though also strong-willed and strict in temperament. Her only son, José Vázquez Varela Borcino, locally known as Varelita or El Pollo Varela, had acquired a troubled reputation. Whether due to the early loss of his father, by indulgence, or by temperament, he led a disorderly life and was frequently seen in questionable company. He had already been imprisoned on several occasions for violence, including hitting his own mother and stabbing his girlfriend, a woman named Dolores Gutierrez Robles. The relationship between mother and son was volatile, and neighbours often reported loud quarrels coming from the apartment. Most of them were disputes over money. For Senora Luciana, her son was both her pride and her anxiety, but she refused to indulge his excesses, and that refusal seemed only to breed resentment. The disputes often centred on money, and had become a familiar part of life within the apartment. In June 1888, Senora Luciana hired a new maid, named Higinia Balaguerostale. She was 30 years old, and had worked in several Madrid households. Her references were good, and she had previously been employed by José Milán Estrella, the interim director of the prison, and he had described her as reliable and hardworking. Senora Luciana had hired a number of maids, but none had stayed very long. Many who left her service complained of her demanding nature and her explosive temper. When Higinia started working at number 109 Fuencarral Street, she was quiet and efficient and did not draw any attention upon herself. The residence occupied the second floor, and as customary for the period, it had a long, narrow corridor stretching inward from the entrance, with rooms opening off it. Senora Luciana also had a dog, which many who knew her considered was a practical precaution, especially as she was a widow and was known to keep money in her apartment. However, beyond the walls of 109 Fuencarral Street, Madrid was changing. As the city grew, newspapers were appearing in even greater numbers. Cafes were filled each evening with discussion of politics, scandal and society, and even those who could not read were rarely cut off from events, as articles were read aloud, shared and debated in doorways and taverns. There was a clear hunger for news, particularly for stories that stirred emotion and curiosity. Just after midnight on the 2nd of July 1888, residents of 109 Fuencarral Street noticed a heavy smell in the corridors. They recognised oil and smoke, but there was something else that smelt unmistakably grim. Alarmed, the doorman ran down the street to fetch help, and soon the police arrived. Officers forced their way into the apartment, and inside they discovered the body of Senora Luciana. She was lying in her bed, her body partially burned, with charred rags clinging to her remains. The room showed signs of fire, yet not the widespread damage that would have been expected, and as the police looked closer, they saw that she had been stabbed 3 times, and one of the stab wounds was through the heart. In an adjacent room, they found Higinia Balguer. She was unconscious and seemingly under the effects of a substance. The dog, too, had been somehow silenced. The police carefully inspected the apartment, anxious to establish a clear motive. Although certain drawers and belongings appeared disturbed, money and valuable items remained in rooms, which raised immediate doubts about a simple theft. It was evident that Luciana Borcino had been murdered, and that the fire, along with the deliberate disorder in the bedroom, had intended to mislead investigators, perhaps to suggest a robbery that had taken a violent turn, rather than a planned killing. At first, Higinia told officers that she could remember nothing about the crime, a claim that investigators thought was impossible to reconcile, especially with the scene before them. As their inquiries deepened, they began to uncover details about her recent associations. Neighbours and acquaintances described her as keeping company with individuals already known to the police, people connected with idleness, dishonesty and petty theft. One such person was a woman named Dolores Avila, who had a reputation for being a somewhat devious character. As the days passed, cracks appeared in her accounts. What had begun as professed ignorance slowly gave way to a more elaborate explanation. She now claimed that a man had entered the apartment and carried out the crime. Yet when officers retraced the movements of everyone in the building, they found nothing to support her new version of events. Neither neighbours or the doorman had seen a stranger arrive or depart, and no trace of forced entry could be established. Under continued questioning, she named the supposed intruder as José Vázquez Varela Borcino, Senora Luciana's son. Now, according to Higinia, he had come to the apartment, murdered his mother, and then compelled her to assist him in concealing the deed. She alleged that he forced her to purchase oil, scrub away the bloodstains, and set fire to the body. She said that she had been overcome with fear, and he made her swallow a substance that rendered her unconscious, leaving her unable to resist or raise the alarm. News of the murder spread quickly through Madrid, and although the police looked upon her statement with some skepticism, there were many in the city who believed her. Senora Luciana's son had a troubled reputation, and it was well known that he often quarrelled violently with his mother. Yet her story soon met with a serious difficulty. On the night of the 1st of July, José was officially recorded as being confined in the local prison, having been charged with stealing a cloak. Even so, rumours began to circulate that certain inmates, particularly those from respectable families, were often granted quiet liberties, such as being allowed to walk out of their cell. The prison director knew Senora Luciana and her family, and had recommended Higinia to them as their maid. With this knowledge, suspicion began to grow that José might not in fact have spent the entire night behind bars. As the police continued to question Higinia, she changed her story once again and confessed that she had stabbed her mistress, though she stressed that it had not been deliberate. She said that she had accidentally broken a vase, and that her mistress had shouted at her in such a way that it made her very frightened, and without thinking, she grabbed a knife and stabbed her. Despite this confession, the investigators were still not convinced it was true. In their opinion, the evidence pointed to premeditation rather than impulse. The dog had been deliberately drugged, oil had been purchased beforehand, and the fire had been set with care. To them it seemed more like a planned murder, and probably involved others, not just Higinia. Newspapers were very interested in the confession, and publications such as El Liberal and La Correspondencia de España devoted daily columns to every rumour and development. They wrote stories, some true and some fabricated, which held the attention of the Spanish public, who seemed to be captivated by the mixture of violence and scandal. What had begun as a domestic tragedy was becoming a public spectacle. As the investigation continued, the police evidence strongly suggested that this had been a planned act, perhaps with the knowledge that the widow kept money in the apartment. Despite this, the city of Madrid seemed to be divided. Some, who the newspapers named Higienistas, believed that the maid was innocent, or at least less culpable, and suspected that Jose had escaped prison long enough to commit the crime. Others, labelled the Varalistas, believed that the maid had been responsible. They defended the son and considered the accusations against him an injustice, which had been fueled by class prejudice. The story became so popular that crowds gathered at night outside newspaper offices, waiting for fresh editions to come out. However, it seemed very apparent that the boundary between fact and conjecture had become blurred, as the press were just fueling the public appetites for an elaborated story. By the end of July 1888, the murder of Luciana Borcino was no longer merely a criminal investigation. It was a turning point in Spanish public life. A case in which justice, journalism, class tension, and urban curiosity had converged. The maid, Higinia Balaguer, now stood at the centre of a national drama, and the modest apartment at 109 Fuencarral Street had secured a place in Spanish history. Higinia Balaguer, Jose Vázquez Varela Borcino, Dolores Avila, and Jose Milan Astre were all charged. The trial, however, did not begin until the 26th of March 1889, and surprisingly, public interest had not diminished in the months since the crime. If anything, it had intensified. Spectators queued through the night in the hopes of securing entry into the courtroom, and from the outset, it was clear that this would be more than a simple criminal hearing. It was the climax of a national drama. Higinia's defence was entrusted to Nicolas Salmerón, a former president of the First Spanish Republic. His presence gave the defence greater credibility and drew added public and political attention to the case. Some believed his reputation alone might sway opinion. Others suspected that even his eloquence would struggle against all the evidence. The prosecution arrived well prepared. They laid out a timeline of events, which was designed to demonstrate premeditation rather than panic. Evidence showed that oil had been purchased before the murder, and they could also prove that the household dog had been sedated. Witnesses described Higinia's association with Dolores Avila, who also stood trial accused of helping conceal stolen money and assisting in the aftermath of the crime. The prosecution claimed that she too had been instrumental in the death of Senora Luciana. The prosecution reminded the courts that when the police first spoke to Higinia, she claimed that she remembered nothing about the crime. Then later she had said that an intruder had come to the apartment and killed her mistress, and following this, she had told the police that it was in fact Senora Luciana's son who had killed his mother. Looking at the judge and the jury, the prosecutor said that this raised the obvious question of how she could possibly be believed after changing her statement so many times. When Higinia was put on the stand, she admitted that she stabbed her mistress, yet she framed the act as a result of a sudden domestic quarrel. She repeated the now infamous explanation that she had broken a vase, and in a moment of humiliation had lost her self-control. Her counsel sought to humanize her, telling the court that she was a servant under strain. She was frightened, and then startled into violence. The defense again raised the question as to the involvement of Jose Vázquez Varela, suggesting coercion and moral pressure, even if his direct physical presence could not be proven. Many people are excited by the fact that both Jose Vasquez Varela Borcino and Jose Milan Astre were also on trial, and hoped that their inclusion would ensure that the long circulating rumours of prison privileges and secret absences would be examined in court. Yet as more witnesses were presented, the more the case against them weakened. Records of Jose Vasquez Varela Borcino's confinement proved difficult to disprove, and although suspicion remained in the public mind that he had been allowed to leave his cell, there was no proof that this actually happened. Gradually it became evident that there was no solid evidence placing him or Jose Milan Astre at the scene. With the case against the two men falling away, eyes were now firmly on Higinia Balaguer and Dolores Avila. The prosecution portrayed both women not as frightened domestic workers who had been overwhelmed by circumstance, but as calculating criminals who had robbed and murdered a defenceless widow for financial gain. Newspapers reported the proceedings in detail, often including descriptions of gestures, pauses and exchanges in the courtroom. They interpreted the testimony and conduct of the witnesses, as well as those on trial, and as a result the case was considered not only by the judges and the jury, but also by the public that followed each detail of the trial with close attention. On the 25th of May 1889, the verdict was delivered. Both women were found guilty. Higinia Balaguer was sentenced to death for the combined crime of robbery and murder, while Dolores Avila was convicted as an accomplice and received 18 years imprisonment. Jose Vasquez Varela Borcino and Jose Milan Astre were acquitted. However, execution did not follow immediately. Appeals extended the process for more than a year. Higinia's sentence was eventually carried out on the 19th of July 1890, before a crowd estimated to be 20,000 people. She was executed by garrotes, and she was the last person to be publicly executed in Madrid. In her final moments, she cried out the words, "Dolores, 14,000 duros." The meaning of these words were never conclusively explained. Some believed it referred to stolen money, others considered it an accusation, or a final attempt to implicate another. In the years that followed, the building on Fuencarral Street gradually receded from daily attention. Urban reforms altered the numbering, and the infamous 109 later became 95. In time, a guest house occupied the rooms where Luciana had lived and died, yet the memory of what happened there in 1888 continued. Two expressions entered popular speech. One, to be more famous than the crime on Fuencarral streets, and the other, to be like the porter of Fuencarral. Although Luciana's son Jose was acquitted, it did not bring him a settled life. Years later he was implicated in another suspicious death, this one involving a woman who fell from a building in Calle de la Montera. He was convicted and spent 14 years in prison. During his incarceration, he learned photography, and upon his release he opened a studio. The crime of 109 Fuencarral Street had marked a decisive moment in Spanish legal and journalistic culture. It demonstrated how quickly public opinion could be mobilized, how newspapers could write and sometimes distort the truth, and how questions of class, credibility, authority, guilt and innocence could be argued not only in courts, but in shops, cafes, bars, and houses across Madrid. Even though 109 has disappeared from Fuencarral streets, what happened there in July 1888 has not been forgotten. It remains a well-known case in Spanish history and is still talked about today. I would like to once again thank the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization, for sponsoring today's video, and if you would like to buy a copy, please either scan the QR code or click on my link in the description. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.